In a world carved from dust and judgment, a man can be branded an outlaw not for the laws he breaks, but for the truths he refuses to ignore. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. Silas rode through the canyon, the late afternoon sun bleeding across the mesas, painting the rock in hues of rust and dried blood. He was a man shaped by the landscape, all hard lines and quiet endurance, his face a testament to wind and sun and a solitude he had chosen long ago. Or perhaps, a solitude that had chosen him. He wasn't looking for trouble. Trouble, in his experience, was a predator that smelled desperation, and Silas had made a life of smelling of nothing at all. He kept to his ranch, a lonely patch of defiance on the edge of a world that had cast him out. But the world has long arms. It reaches. It hangs its forgotten sins from the limbs of cottonwood trees, leaving them to twist in the wind like a question nobody wants to answer. He saw it from a distance, a strange, broken shape against the familiar gray-green of the trees. Not a calf caught in a snare, not a coyote, something else. The air grew still as he drew closer, the only sound the soft plod of his horse's hooves in the dirt. Then he saw her, a child, a girl no older than 12, her body limp, suspended by a rope looped crudely under her arms. Her feet dangled a foot above the ground, one shoe missing, the other scuffed and worn. She was black, in a county where her very existence was a provocation, and pinned to the front of her tattered dress was a piece of cardboard, the words scrawled in thick, mocking charcoal, "Kick me." The sign was an act of cruelty so profound, so utterly devoid of humanity, it felt like a physical blow. It was a dare, a statement. It was the town with all its unspoken rules and simmering hatreds condensed into 2 words. Silas stopped his horse, his hand resting on the worn leather of his saddle horn. The silence of the canyon was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating, thick with the weight of what he was seeing. He could turn around. He could ride away and let the wilderness claim this discarded piece of humanity. It was not his fight. He had learned, the hard way, that some fights cannot be won. He could go back to his quiet, empty cabin and pretend he had seen nothing. He could remain an outlaw of geography, not of conscience, but his eyes met the scrawled words, and he knew. The world with its long, cruel arms had finally reached him. He dismounted, his movements slow, deliberate, as if wading through a current of unseen resistance. The ground was littered with small stones, and his boots crunched, the sound unnervatingly loud in the oppressive quiet. Every step toward the girl was a step away from the life he had so carefully constructed, a life of managed bitterness and self-imposed exile. The rope was thick, abrasive, cutting into the bark of the cottonwood. Whoever did this had not been concerned with subtlety. It was a display, a lesson. He looked at the girl's face turned to the side, her cheek pressed against the rough fabric of her dress. Her eyes were closed, but her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper, a tiny flag of life in a sea of degradation. He reached for his knife, the handle smooth and familiar in his palm. This was the point of no return. Cutting the rope was an act of intervention, an acceptance of a burden he did not want. The town, with its rigid pews and its smiling, hollow-eyed sheriff, would not see this as mercy. They would see it as theft. He was stealing their effigy, their warning. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, flashed in his mind. His own father years ago, standing on the porch, his face grim. "Some folks build their church on a foundation of hate, son," he'd said, "and they don't take kindly to anyone pointing out the cracks." Silas had been a boy then, naive to the intricate architecture of human cruelty. He wasn't a boy anymore. He sliced through the rope with a single, decisive motion. The girl's small weight fell into him, a dead weight, and he grunted as he caught her, stumbling back a step. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile collection of bones and breath. He held her for a moment, his rough hands foreign against her small frame. He could feel the faint, fluttering beat of her heart against his chest. A life, a whole, breathing life that someone had tried to snuff out and mock in the process. He looked at the sign again, still pinned to her chest. "Kick me." It was more than an instruction, it was a philosophy. It was the core belief of the men who put it there, that some people were born to be kicked, to be used as footstools for the fragile pride of others. He gently unpinned the sign, his fingers fumbling with the simple mechanism, and crumpled the cardboard in his fist. He would not leave it here. He would not leave any part of this desecration behind. He carried her to his horse, laying her carefully across the saddle and mounted behind her. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He only knew that her fight was now his. As he turned his horse back toward the isolation of his ranch, he felt the weight of her not just across his saddle, but across his soul. The sun had dipped below the mesas, and long, cold shadows stretched out from the east, like fingers reaching from the town he had tried so hard to forget. The interior of Silas's cabin was a reflection of its owner, sparse, functional, and devoid of sentiment. A single iron bed frame stood against one wall, a stone fireplace against the other. A table, 2 chairs, and a collection of shelves holding tins and tools filled the rest of the space. It was a place built for survival, not comfort, and the sudden presence of the girl seemed to warp the very air within it. He laid her on his own bed, the rough wool blanket a stark contrast to her dark skin. She was still unconscious, her breathing a little steadier now, away from the choking dust of the canyon. He saw now that her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the foot turned inward, a disability that likely made her an easy target. He stood over her, a hulking, uncertain shadow in the dim light of the single lantern he'd lit. What was he supposed to do? He knew how to set a fence post, how to track a stray steer, how to read the sky for rain. He did not know how to care for a broken child. He filled a basin with water from the pump outside, his hands calloused and scarred from years of hard labor, feeling clumsy as he dipped a rag into the cool liquid. He hesitated, then began to gently wipe the grime from her face. Her skin was soft beneath the layers of dirt. She stirred under his touch, a small whimper escaping her lips, and her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, deep, and filled with a terror so profound it silenced the air in the room. She scrambled backward on the bed, crab walking away from him until her back hit the solid wood of the wall, her good leg kicking out feebly. She didn't scream. Her fear was a silent, all-consuming thing. Silas held up his hands, palms open, a gesture he used to soothe a spooked horse. "Easy," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." The words felt inadequate, hollow. Why should she believe him? The last hands that touched her had strung her up from a tree. He backed away slowly, giving her space, the basin of water still in his hand. He placed it on the floor and retreated to the far side of the small cabin, sitting heavily in one of the wooden chairs. He watched her, a cornered animal, her chest heaving with silent panic. The crumpled cardboard sign was on the table beside him, a toxic reminder. He had brought her into his sanctuary, but in doing so, he had brought her terror with her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It was a standoff between his guilt and her fear. He was an outcast, a man who had intentionally severed his ties with the world. And now, the world, in its most vulnerable and brutalized form, was sitting on his bed, looking at him as if he were the monster. He needed supplies. The girl, who he'd learned was named Alara from a small, faded name tag sewn into the collar of her dress, had not spoken a word. She ate what little he offered, her eyes darting around the cabin, constantly tracking his movements. But she needed more than the salted meat and hardtack that sustained him. She needed medicine for the rope burns on her arms, proper food, perhaps a piece of clothing that wasn't a testament to her trauma. Going to town was a risk. It was a journey into the heart of the very sickness that had nearly killed her. But staying isolated was no longer an option. The town of redemption was a cruel irony of a name. It was a place that offered no such thing, only judgment passed down from dusty storefronts and the cold, assessing gaze of Sheriff Brody. When Silas rode in, the usual quiet whispers that followed him seemed to gain a new, sharper edge. He tied his horse outside the general store, the sound of a player piano drifting weakly from the saloon next door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sawdust, coffee, and suspicion. Miller, the store owner, a man whose spine seemed to be made of jelly, stopped polishing the counter as Silas entered. "Silas," he said, his voice attempting a neutrality that it failed to achieve. "Didn't expect to see you in." "Need some things, Miller," Silas said, his voice flat. He began to list what he needed: ointments, clean bandages, milk, bread. Miller's eyes narrowed slightly at the mention of the ointments. "Bit of trouble out at your place?" he asked, his tone laced with a feigned, venomous concern. "Cattle are fine," Silas replied, his gaze unwavering. Just then the door swung open, and Sheriff Brody stepped in, his presence sucking the remaining air from the room. Brody was a man who wore his authority like a poorly fitted suit, all bluster and threat. "Silas," the sheriff drawled, hooking his thumbs into his belt. "Fancy seeing you. Heard a rumor there was some commotion out your way. Near the old cottonwoods." The words hung in the air, a direct challenge. Brody knew, or he suspected, and in redemption, suspicion was as good as a conviction. "Coyotes gettin' bold," Silas said, his voice calm, betraying none of the tension coiling in his gut. "Nothing a man can't handle." Brody smiled, a thin, predatory slash across his face. "That's good to hear. We like things to be handled out here, quietly. We wouldn't want any complications, especially not from folks who already owe this town a debt of peace." The threat was clear. Silas's past, the reason he was an outcast, a dispute over water rights where he'd stood with a family of Mexican farmers against one of the town's founding fathers, was a ghost that Brody was all too happy to resurrect. Silas paid for his goods, the clink of the coins on the counter feeling like a countdown. He could feel Brody's eyes on his back as he left, a physical weight of malice. He knew this was not the end of it. It was the beginning. Back at the ranch, the silence that greeted him felt different. It was no longer the empty silence of solitude, but the watchful silence of a shared space. Ilara was sitting at the table, her small hands folded in her lap. She had swept the floor. It was a small, almost imperceptible act, but it was a gesture, a crack in the wall of her terror. Silas placed the supplies on the table without a word. He took out the small bottle of milk and a loaf of fresh bread. He poured some milk into a tin cup and sliced the bread, pushing them gently toward her. She looked at the offering, then up at him, her eyes holding a question he couldn't answer. He turned away, busying himself with tending to the fire, giving her the privacy to eat. The cabin was small, but they had already learned to navigate the space around each other's silence, creating invisible boundaries. Later, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows that looked like bars across the floorboards, he sat outside on the porch steps, cleaning his rifle. It was a ritual, a habit, but tonight it felt like a necessity. The confrontation with Brody had unsettled him, stirring up a past he had tried to bury. He remembered the trial, the way the whole town had turned against him, their faces a gallery of righteous indignation. He hadn't broken a law, not really. He had broken a code. He had sided with the voiceless against the powerful, and for that, he was excommunicated, branded an outsider, an outlaw. He had accepted his sentence, retreating into a bitter, self-sufficient exile. He had convinced himself he needed no one. He looked back through the open door of the cabin. Ilara was standing by the window, tracing a pattern on the dusty glass with her finger. She was a ghost in his house, a living embodiment of the world's cruelty. But she was also something else. She was a testament to survival. In her silent, wounded presence, he saw a faint, distorted echo of himself. Both of them were outcasts, discarded by a world that had no use for them. A strange, unwelcome feeling began to surface within him. Not pity, but a sense of shared wreckage. The door creaked as she pushed it open a little wider and stepped out onto the porch. She didn't come near him, but stood by the far post, watching the last sliver of sun disappear behind the mountains. They stood there for a long time, two solitary figures against the vast, indifferent twilight, sharing a silence that was slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to feel less like a wall and more like a bridge. The quiet was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken understanding of the broken. The sound of hoofbeats came 2 days later, just after dawn. It wasn't the slow, meandering tread of a stray cow. It was the rhythmic, determined beat of multiple horses moving with purpose. Silas was by the well, his back to the road, but he knew who it was before he even turned around. Sheriff Brody and 3 other men, deputies by the look of their shiny badges and smug expressions, reined in their horses at the edge of his property. They didn't dismount. They sat on their horses like kings surveying a conquered land, their presence an invasion. Ilara, who had been sitting on the porch steps, scrambled back inside the cabin, the slam of the door echoing in the tense morning air. "Silas," Brody called out, his voice carrying an easy authority that set Silas's teeth on edge. "We're just making our rounds, checking on our neighbors." "I'm not your neighbor, Brody," Silas said, his voice low and even. He didn't move from the well, forcing them to hold their position. It was a small act of defiance, but in this delicate standoff, small things mattered. Now, Brody said with a chuckle that held no humor. "We're all neighbors under God's watchful eye. We heard you bought some medical supplies in town, ointments and such. Just wanted to make sure you're all right, that you haven't had an accident." The word accident was heavy with insinuation. He was giving Silas a chance to lie, to invent a story that would satisfy them and allow them to ride away. The charade of civility maintained. But Silas was tired of charades. He had lived in one for years. "I'm fine," Silas said, his gaze hard. "And my property is fine." One of the deputies, a younger man with cruel, eager eyes, shifted in his saddle. "We have reason to believe you're harboring a runaway, Silas. A colored girl, the one that caused all that trouble over at the Miller place." So that was the story they had concocted. She had caused trouble. They had reframed their own monstrous act as a consequence of her behavior. It was a lie so audacious, so self-serving, it almost took Silas's breath away. "There's no one here but me," Silas said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. But it was a necessary lie, a shield. Brody's smile faded. "We'd like to see for ourselves, just a quick look inside the cabin, to put our minds at ease." "No," Silas said. The word was flat, final. It was a line drawn in the dirt. Brody's hand drifted down, resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Don't make this difficult, Silas. You've been on thin ice with this town for a long time. Don't give me a reason to break it." The threat was no longer veiled. The pretense was gone. This was what they had come for. A confrontation, a reassertion of their power. Silas stood his ground, the bucket of water still in his hand, feeling the cold weight of it. A pathetic weapon against the four-armed men who represented the law of redemption. That night, a storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple black. Rain lashed against the small cabin, and the wind howled like a grieving animal. Inside, the fire crackled, a lone bastion of warmth against the tempest. Ilara was huddled in a blanket near the hearth, but her shivers had nothing to do with the cold. The sheriff's visit had shattered the fragile peace they had built. She was trapped in a fever of memory, her body trembling, her eyes wide with a terror that saw past the four walls of the cabin and into the darkness of her recent past. Mumbled, broken words fell from her lips, the first sound she had made other than whimpers of pain. They were fragments, disjointed images. Shiny boots, laughing. Silas sat at the table, watching her, feeling a helplessness that was more profound than any physical threat. He could face down Brody and his men, but he could not fight the ghosts that haunted this child. He pieced together the story from her feverish whispers and from the ugly logic of the town he knew so well. She must have been passing through with family, or perhaps she was a laborer's child from one of the outlying farms. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The trouble at the Miller place, the deputy had mentioned. Maybe she had accidentally bumped into one of them, or maybe she had simply looked at them. For men like that, it didn't take much. An excuse was always easy to find when the verdict was already decided. "The sign," she whispered, her voice cracking, her hands clutching the blanket. "He said everyone should know. It wasn't a punishment. It was a proclamation, a public declaration of her worthlessness in their eyes. The laughter she mentioned was the key. It was the detail that turned an act of violence into an act of sport. They had enjoyed it. They had found pleasure in her terror and humiliation. Silas felt a cold, hard rage solidify in his chest. It was different from the simmering bitterness he had carried for years. This was a clean, sharp anger. It was the anger of his father, the man who had warned him about the cracks in the foundation of the world. He had spent years ignoring those cracks, content to live in his own isolated ruin. But now, the ruin had a new resident. He looked at Ilara, her small form silhouetted by the firelight, a survivor of a war she never chose to fight. He understood now. Protecting her wasn't just about saving her life. It was about defying the world that had tried to erase her. It was about standing in the cracks and refusing to let them widen. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the one inside his own heart. The time for hiding was over. The time for passive resistance was gone. The world had come to his door, and now he was going to have to answer. The next morning, the air was washed clean by the storm, but the tension remained, thicker than the mud in the yard. Silas knew they would be back. Brody wasn't a man to let a challenge go unanswered. The no Silas had given him was a debt that would be collected. He was at a crossroads, the path forward obscured by fog and danger. He could run. He could pack what little he owned, take Alara, and disappear into the wilderness. They could find a new place to be invisible, a new patch of lonely land to call their own. It was the sensible choice, the survivor's choice. It was the choice he had made for himself years ago. He looked over at Alara. She was outside by the fence, her gaze fixed on the distant, hazy outline of the mountains. She was using a sturdy branch as a makeshift crutch, her movements slow but determined. The clear morning light, he could see the faintest hint of a smile on her face as she watched a hawk circle high above. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a person, a quiet, resilient girl who found a moment of peace in a soaring bird. To run would be to teach her the same lesson he had taught himself, that the only way to deal with monsters is to cede the world to them, that survival is found in retreat. He thought of the crumpled cardboard sign he had kept, tucked away on a high shelf like a piece of poison. Kick me. Running was just another way of letting them kick you. It was letting them win not just the battle, but the war for your soul. He walked over to her, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He stood beside her, following her gaze to the hawk. "He's looking for breakfast," Silas said, his voice quiet. Alara glanced at him, then back at the hawk. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a conversation, their longest one yet. In that moment, the choice became clear. It was no longer about his own bitterness or his desire for solitude. It was about the small, silent girl beside him who deserved to watch a hawk fly without having to look over her shoulder. It was about the belief that some places, some people, are worth fighting for, even if the fight seems impossible. He would not run. He would not cede this ground. He had been an outlaw by their definition for years. Now he would become one by his own. He would stand against the sickness of redemption, not with the hope of winning, but with the simple, unshakable conviction that it was the right thing to do. He had found something to protect that was more important than his own lonely peace. They came at dusk, when the fading light could hide their faces and amplify the terror of their arrival. This time there were more of them, a dozen men on horseback, their forms dark silhouettes against the fiery sunset. They weren't wearing badges now. They were a mob, stripped of any pretense of law. Brody was at their head, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "Last chance, Silas," he yelled, his voice echoing across the silent ranch. "Send the girl out. Nobody else has to get hurt." Silas stood on the porch of his cabin, his rifle held loosely in his hands. He had sent Alara to the small, dark root cellar, telling her to stay there no matter what she heard. He was alone. One man against a dozen. The odds were impossible. It was a fool's stand. "She's not coming out, Brody," Silas called back, his voice steady. "You want her, you have to come through me." A nervous murmur went through the mob. Some of them were just followers, men caught up in the momentum of hatred, their courage bolstered by the crowd. Others, he could see, were the true believers. He recognized the young, cruel-eyed deputy from the general store. His name was Cale. He looked eager, his hand already on his gun. "He's protecting a thief and a runaway," Cale shouted, stoking the fire. "He's turned his back on his own kind." The accusation hung in the air, the ultimate sin in their world. Silas didn't answer. There was no point in arguing with a wildfire. He raised his rifle not to aim, but as a statement. This was as far as they would come. Brody gave a signal, and the men began to dismount, spreading out, flanking the cabin. The metallic click of rifles being cocked sounded like a death knell in the twilight. The moment stretched, taut and brittle. It was going to be a slaughter, his slaughter. But as the first man took a step forward, a sound came from the side of the house, small and clear in the tense silence. It was a voice, Ilara's voice. She had not obeyed him. She was standing near the corner of the cabin, one hand braced against the wood, the other pointing a small, trembling finger. She was pointing directly at Cale. "Shiny boots," she said, her voice raspy but clear, carrying across the yard. He was laughing. The mob froze. Every eye turned from Silas to the deputy. Cale's face went pale, his bravado instantly evaporating. "She's lying. The girl's a liar," he stammered, his voice suddenly high-pitched. But Ilara wasn't finished. She looked at another man, a portly farmer Silas recognized. "And you," she whispered, her voice gaining strength. "You held the rope." A wave of shock and uncertainty rippled through the men. The narrative had shattered. This wasn't a righteous posse coming to claim a runaway. This was a group of accomplices being identified by their victim. The shared guilt that had bound them together was now an anchor, pulling them down individually. The other men looked at Cale and the farmer, their expressions shifting from mob fury to suspicion and disgust. They were not here to defend child abusers. They were here for a different, cleaner kind of hate. The mob dissolved. It didn't break in a panic, but evaporated slowly, shamefully. Men who had ridden out with righteous fire in their bellies now avoided each other's eyes, mounting their horses and retreating back into the twilight from which they came. They left Cale and the farmer standing alone in the yard, exposed and condemned by the testimony of a 12-year-old girl. Sheriff Brody, his authority utterly dismantled, stared at Silas, then at Ilara, his face a mixture of fury and defeat. He said nothing. He simply turned his horse and rode away, abandoning his men, abandoning the last shred of his credibility. The silence that fell over the ranch was profound. It was the silence of a fever that is finally broken. Silas lowered his rifle, the tension draining out of him, leaving him feeling hollow and shaky. He walked over to Ilara, who was still standing by the wall, her small body trembling with the aftershock of her own courage. He knelt in front of her, his knees cracking. He didn't know what to say. "Thank you" felt too small. "I'm sorry" felt like a lie. He simply reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of shared victory. She looked at him, and for the first time, the terror in her eyes was gone. It was replaced by something else, something that looked like trust. The next day, Silas took the crumpled cardboard sign from the shelf. He walked to the fire pit, Ilara following a few steps behind him. He looked at the ugly, scrawled words one last time. "Kick me." It was a curse, a brand, a philosophy of hate. He tossed it into the pit and lit a match. They watched together as the flames curled around the edges of the cardboard, turning the black letters to gray ash, then to nothing. It was not an ending. The town of redemption was still there. The world was still filled with men like Brody and Cale. The future was a vast, unmapped territory of uncertainty. But something fundamental had shifted. Silas was no longer just an outcast defined by his past. He was a guardian, and Ilara was no longer just a victim defined by her trauma. She was a survivor who had found her voice. He looked out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of rock and sky that was his home. It was no longer a place of exile. It was a sanctuary, a place where two broken people had stood their ground and, against all odds, had begun to heal. The world was still full of long, cruel arms, but here, in this small corner of it, they had built a fortress of two. And for now, that was enough. It was more than enough. It was hope.